Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and wherever you're calling in from today, and welcome to our Red Line Space on what does Pelosi's trip to Taiwan mean for US-China policy. Joining us, I'm actually not going to be your host today. The Red Line team is not just me, although even if you listen to my terrible voice all the time. Joining us today is Francis Leach, a veteran journalist who's been reporting for everything from Triple J to the ABC and a foreign policy buff. Eric Gomez from CATO is here with us today as well. I'm going to hand over to Francis. This is Francis' first time hosting a space. And on a very, very topical time, considering news has just broken that Pelosi will be landing in Taiwan within the next 2 hours. So I'm going to hand over to our new Spaces host, Francis Leach, and I'm going to sit back and just be the panelist on this one.
Thank you, Michael, and good evening, everybody, or good morning, wherever you are in the world, for this important Twitter Space conversation today, at a time where we couldn't have timed it any better for it, because as we speak, people all over the globe right now are tracking one particular aircraft as it makes its way to Taipei, and it is Nancy Pelosi paying a visit to Taiwan at a time of heightened tensions in the region, and at a time when there's great uncertainty around what will be the response from China to this visit, which has been seen as well, definitely provocative in one sense, and will leave open a whole range of questions as to what happens next. So let's start that conversation with Eric Gomez, who joins us here on the panel tonight to have a conversation. Eric is Director of Defence Policy Studies at the CATO Institute, and his research focuses on US military budget and force posture, and he's got a particular expertise in the area of East Asia, so this is very much in his wheelhouse. So let's welcome him to the conversation this morning and this evening. Hello, Eric. How are you?
Good morning, y'all. Thanks for having me on. I've been a semi-regular guest on the Red Line podcast, and it's been a great time every time. So I'm glad you guys invited me to this, and I'm excited to be here.
Eric, have you been following the Pelosi plane? Let's start there. It's being tracked by people all over the world. Have you been following? And is she making her way to Taipei as we speak?
Oh yeah, they took a northward turn, I think somewhere east of the Philippines now, and yeah, it's happening, y'all. Get ready, strap in, get the popcorn. It's gonna be an interesting few days.
Well, she's likely to be there less than a day in total. She'll arrive there late at night and have meetings in the morning. So it'll be fascinating to see just how long she spends there and who she meets with. But let's go back a bit and talk about where things stand as we sit. So if you had to make an assessment, and it is literally at the moment an hour-by-hour assessment, what is the state of the strategic balance between China, Taiwan, and the United States as we sit here today?
So the state of the balance is, well, I guess the state of the relationship is not great. U.S.-China relations took this nosedive during the Trump administration, when Trump was big on the trade war with China, and also in general posturing U.S. foreign policy rhetoric and framing towards great power competition with Russia as well, but also with China as a primary focus of that. And then the Biden administration has largely continued this, albeit a little less fiery on the rhetoric as Trump was prone to do. But the consensus view in Washington is that, China represents this serious challenger, the serious threat, and the United States is going to compete with it very strongly. I've often said that competition isn't a strategy; it's just a description of a relationship. So I don't know if there is, and I know that the admin has released some Indo-Pacific strategies to try and flesh out what it wants and what it plans on doing. I think some of those have helped, right, to give a sense of what U.S. objectives are in the region. But overall, the mood in Washington is very much compete, compete, compete. And when it comes to Taiwan and the role that it plays in this, I don't know if it's going to produce a definitive policy shift, but there is this growing dissatisfaction among members of Congress, particularly who are Congress tends to be very supportive of Taiwan and tough on China. And that has gotten all the more so in the last couple of years, where I think there's a lot of frustration with the one China policy, frustration with strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan within U.S. policymaking circles. And so we can talk more about this, but I think the Pelosi trip, I'm almost not as worried about it in and of itself, but I am more worried about certain long-term trends in both Chinese and the United States actions that could spell like a move towards a new crisis, whether it's this week or down the line. I think one's coming. So we can get into that.
Can I just ask, I mean, because that strategic ambiguity has held firm predominantly for the better part of 70 years. I mean, it's kept a delicate balance, but China has changed and the United States is changing as well. Has the one country, two systems or the strategic ambiguity doctrine run its course?
I don't think so. But I think this is when it comes to Taiwan, this is sort of the big background question, right? So strategic ambiguity refers to this. The more official term, I suppose, would be the U.S. One China policy, which says we acknowledge China's position that there is only one China. It is not the same as fully agreeing with it. And the Chinese side and the U.S. side have interpreted this policy somewhat differently over the years. But it's this where the ambiguity comes from is, does the U.S. have this sort of firm defense commitment to Taiwan or not? And we've
Sorry, Eric. I think you're a bit muted there.
Oh God, I'm sorry. Jeez. Wow. All right, that was embarrassing. I've just been talking to myself for the last 30 seconds. Okay, let me try to rewind here. So yeah, the one China policy and strategic ambiguity. So America's one China policy, we adopted it in the 70s as part of this. Let's call it the price of admission to have normal relations with communist China. And at the time, it was this acknowledgement that the U.S. recognizes China's position on Taiwan, but it doesn't accept it. And it's that U.S. interest would be in maintaining peace in the Taiwan Strait, leaving the issue of Taiwan's independence or joining with China as a question for Taiwan itself. We do not support Taiwanese de jure independence, but the U.S. will provide defensive weapons to Taiwan or weapons to Taiwan as part of this policy, right? That's the basic outline of what this all is. The reason why it's coming under stress in the United States is that the belief of, well, okay, if China is indeed this clear threat or challenger to the United States, does ambiguity help you prevent a conflict? And I think the argument that the people who want to get rid of ambiguity say is no, right? Like that ambiguity could help create a conflict by not being clear, and that the U.S. ought to set clearer red lines in order to deter China. I am somewhat suspicious of this argument because I think what this is a very sort of military way of thinking about things. It's a very deterrence way of thinking about this conflict.
Yeah.
But I think that misses what strategic ambiguity buys politically, right? Because like I said before, it was the price of admission. If you wanted to have a official diplomatic relationship with China, that was what the U.S. policy had to be. And I think that when we talk about abandoning strategic ambiguity, when we talk about putting ourselves on a clearer footing towards Taiwan, I think that argument underplays the sort of near-term political risk in an effort to kind of establish a more favorable long-term security or defense picture.
Yeah. Well, the question is, isn't it? I mean, President Biden has said a number of times that, quite directly, that the United States would engage in a hot war with China if Taiwan was attacked, and he has walked that back. But that has been said, so it's a position that that does break that fourth wall of strategic ambiguity. Michael Hilliard, I just want to invite you in here on this just quickly. Do you think the situation in Ukraine has changed the calculations? And what I mean by that is that for so long, strategic ambiguity was a comfortable grey zone to sit in because nobody could really or was prepared to envisage a conflict actually starting, that anyone would be bold enough. It's almost like I guess the theory of mutually assured destruction. Nobody wanted a war because a war would be too costly. But now we've seen with Russia in Ukraine that idea has been shattered. Does that change the calculations here as well?
Very much so. I think China is very much watching how the world is responding to Ukraine. And I, as a person who follows sort of Russia and the Eastern Bloc very closely, if you had told me in January that I would be driving down the road in Australia and seeing people with Slava Ukrainia on the back of their cars and bumper stickers and people waving Ukrainian flags everywhere, I would have called you crazy. I didn't think that majority of the people could even put Ukraine on the map. But watching how quickly not only the sort of global community, but a lot of the Western community has got behind this in a pretty unified manner, which is unlike the West has been for quite a while now, has probably put a huge calculation shift in China. They've seen these sanctions come down upon Russia, and Russia has a very different economy to China. It's reliant on mostly getting petrochemicals out the door and grain out the door, whereas China is mostly about consumer goods. We are seeing already the Biden administration putting the PGII, which is effectively their answer to the Belt and Road Initiative, forward to try and convince companies to leave China and start to already begin that process of decoupling. And that's already freaking out people in China's planning, because obviously they don't want the international business to leave. That's a huge part of the Chinese economy. If they're freaking out over what Biden's putting forward with PGII, God help them if they can see a huge pullback like there has been after the war in Ukraine. So it is a very much being watched very closely by China. Although with Ukraine, Russia didn't have to get across the Taiwan Strait. So that is a very different one. And unlike Taiwan, who has some sort of not fully codified agreement with America, but a good defense backing by America, Ukraine never had any of that. So there is a much more certainty the Americans would come to the aid of Taiwan over than they would for Ukraine. And if the Americans are willing to effectively arm the Ukrainians to the teeth, and that's Ukraine, they would very much be giving far more support than that to Taiwan. So I think, yes, Beijing is watching this very closely, and I think it was a bit of a shock that, that unlike 2014 and the invasion of Crimea, that the rest of the world reacted to this, and this actually became a big story.
Eric, the doctrine of strategic ambiguity kind of suited Taiwan for a long time as well. As much as it wanted to assert its full independence as a nation state, I think the pragmatic view in Taipei would have been, well, this is the next best thing without the threat of China being coming across the Taiwan Strait and destroying the democratic state there. So how are they calculating the risk here as well? That for a long time they've wanted diplomatic recognition like this as a way to affirm their independence and their status, but at the same time it comes with enormous risk. So what does that look like in Taipei today?
So that's a good question. I mean, I think Tsai Ing-wen, the current president of Taiwan, has been very careful on this front. She has been very good about sticking to insistences that she does not seek legal independence from China, right? Like that those red lines won't be crossed, which I think is a good thing, because Previous presidents from her party have not been so clear on that. You mentioned that strategic ambiguity has helped us sit on the Taiwanese in the past when they have wanted to be more serious on the independence front. Most notably in 2004, the Taiwanese presidential elections, there was a ballot measure on a referendum on independence in that election, and the United States under the Bush administration had to send a lot of signals to the Taiwanese government of like, hey, look, if this starts a war, you know, you guys are kind of doing this. We don't want you to, and we can't assure you that we'll show up, in an effort to kind of get them to cool their heels. I think in the current geopolitical climate, we, number one, Taiwan wouldn't do that. But number two, that the U.S. would also be, I think, less hard pressed to sort of push back on the Taiwanese. So in terms of how Taiwan is thinking about this right now, I mean, I think there is this desire to get Pelosi there, to that it could be a good thing for establishing a precedent for visits of higher ranking U.S. officials more regularly to Taiwan, which is something that the Taiwanese government wants. I think that in terms of the how are they thinking about it, I'm not sure anyone on the U.S. or Taiwanese side is making this sort of distinction I mentioned earlier. And I don't mean about like, short-term political risk versus like longer-term deterrent benefit. And I don't, I'm not trying to say that to be like, I have this unique insight that no one else has. But I do have unique insights that no one else has, which is why you should all stay in this room. No, but I think it's one of these things where I don't. China's already starting to do some stuff, right? They've sent some ships and aircraft close to the median line of the Taiwan Strait already, like within the last 24 hours, and they've put on some export bans. It looks like that they're DDoSing Taiwanese government websites. I don't know. I don't know if there's enough appreciation on the U.S. side and the Taiwanese side of like how bad things could get over this. I think that there's this tendency, at least now. This isn't about government sources or information, but more about just like what I've seen on from analysts and heard from them. It seems like most analysts out there who work on Asia are like, oh, what's the big deal, right? We've had CODELs before, congressional delegations visit Taiwan. Newt Gingrich, when he was speaker, visited in '97. That was the last time a speaker of the House visited. China's turning a mountain out of a molehill, which I think is just bad. I mean, it's bad analysis. I mean, I think that like you can say that all you want, but the fact is, I think the mountain's coming, even if you think it's a silly mountain to build.
Well, I mean, just what you said there is fascinating, because what it suggests is that that assessment of China is static. That, to even compare the Gingrich visit in '97 to a visit in 2022 under Xi, China is a completely different place with a different outlook on the world and a different capacity to actually assert itself. I mean, it's alarming that would even be a calculation.
It's, I mean, I don't know if that's a calculation of like the specifically the China hands, but it is something that I've seen from like accounts out of like Taiwan and on the US, like other Asia analysts who maybe aren't like first and foremost like Taiwan China analysts. And it's like, on the one hand, yeah, okay, like I don't know. I feel like you can say this a lot of times where it's like, well, their reaction is the problem, right? And if only I see this a lot because I do a lot on North Korea. There's this tendency for people to go, well, if only Kim Jong-un like decided tomorrow that nukes weren't important to his regime, and also that he became like this, if he just like emptied all the political prisons, then wouldn't things be great? And it's like, well, yeah, that would be great, but that's not how it works. Like, that's not how that's going to happen. And I think that's a similar thing with this stuff with Pelosi. It's like, oh, well, China doesn't have to overreact and they could just let this happen and say nothing. It's like, I mean, yeah, they could. They won't, but they could. And I'd rather worry about what they probably will do than what they won't do.
I think
So, yeah,
I think
it's been a very frustrating set of days to watch this all happen.
I think the other, just sort of jump in and expand on this question. One of the other interesting facts is, we are coming up to the US midterms, and the Chinese Communist Party is due to meet in October as well. And I think there's a lot of people going, if Pelosi was to, let's say, back down and not go to Taiwan, then that would be great fuel for the midterms going, Pelosi's weak on China and Pelosi caved to Xi and rah, 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 and Xi would likely have the same thing had he not said anything. So I think that's definitely probably playing into the calculations in both of them that, neither can afford to lose face here. And as someone who's read the Guns of August quite a few times, it does, I don't think either side wants to go to war tonight, but there's always that question looming overhead of, if a Chinese fighter jet decides to accidentally stray into an area and is shot down by the US, then China will have to respond to that. And that's when no one can back down and no one has the political will to back down, then that leads to escalations that neither side probably really actually wants.
Yeah, and that I'm not, to be clear on this, I am not worried. I do not think that this situation with Pelosi in Taiwan and the reactions to it is going to cause like a US-China conflict over Taiwan. What I'm more worried about is that, number one, there's this larger phenomena in cross-strait politics where, the US side is very worried about Chinese military buildup and Chinese rhetoric and actions around Taiwan. And the Chinese side is very worried about US political movements that they regard as hollowing out the one China policy and signaling a fundamental shift in US position that would be, and cross China's red lines. And the Pelosi visit is like this neat little microcosm that captures a lot of that, right? Because, like you said, Michael, it's become now about resolve. And once I hate it when foreign policy things become about resolve, because it just takes all room for maneuver and gets rid of it, right? Because if it's all about resolve, then you're sort of locked into, all right, well, this is happening, whether or not it's a good strategic idea, whether or not, throw cost benefit aside, it becomes very hard to change course. And I think that I think the Pelosi visit, it won't spark a war, but I think there's a decent chance it could spark a new crisis, a la 1995 to 1996 in the Taiwan Strait, where by bringing militaries into close proximity with one another, the chances of something accidental just goes up. And it also, I think, will harden these two sort of the spiral dynamic between China and the United States, where both sides feels like we have to do something to react to the bad thing that the other one is doing, and then any effort to kind of break that spiral is going to be very difficult.
So what you're saying, Eric, in a way, is what happens here beyond the next 24 hours of this visit, that every freedom of navigation voyage or flyover within the Taiwan Strait or South China Sea suddenly becomes much more critical in terms of what might happen there, because this is seen as an escalation. So any other of those flights or those voyages becomes a provocation of sorts. And so we're playing. It's like putting more chips on the table and spinning the roulette wheel.
Yeah, there's an aspect of that. There's also, I think, this aspect of, I think this will galvanize, in the United States, this is going to galvanize congressional support for doing more things that the Chinese will likely regard as hollowing out of the one China policy. And you know, and there's already like in response to some of the trade measures that China has implemented, I think they've blocked export of, or they've blocked import of I think 100 different fruit and agricultural goods from the Taiwanese already. Um, there's already some reaction to, well, we're going to support them, right? You know, like, well, now that they've done this, well, we have to stand up for Taiwan and support our friend. And it's like, well, yeah, you do, but it's again, I think that deepens this sort of spiral that I talked about, and it just becomes this political mess where it kind of takes over. I think this is going to like take over the U.S.-China relationship. The Taiwan issue is going to become like the big thing for a long time because both sides I are committed to the spiral.
Michael, just your assessment about why Pelosi chosen now to do this. I guess the cynical domestic political view would be that it is to look tough on China heading into what's going to be a very difficult midterm election cycle for the Dems. But she's got a long history of being outspoken on China, and she has in the past also stood up to former presidents, like she did to Bill Clinton on this issue in the past as well. So it isn't like she suddenly decided to become a China hawk of late. But she's the smartest politician in Washington, so she knows what the implications of this are, yet she's going ahead with it, which I find fascinating. She must have, in her own mind, a very strong rationale for doing this. I just can't see what it is.
Well, I think it's two things. I mean, Pelosi was supposed to go do this Asia trip in February or January or somewhere around that particular area, but she got COVID, so they cancelled the trip. You know, I think this is mostly about Biden, who, when he launched the global Build Back Better, it wasn't particularly well received, particularly in the domestic audience. Whereas the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, which is his new version of it, is being better received, and it has much more funding coming in from G7 nations. So the US aren't doing all the funding now. It's a lot of Britain and Britain and France and Italy and Canada putting in as well, and Japan. You know, I think there's been, particularly under the previous administration, a bit of worry that maybe the US isn't as internationally focused as it probably should be. And I think signals like this are really big indicators to particularly your East Asians that the US is here to stamp its foot and is back to do things in East Asia. You know, this is a big signal for, obviously, you know, Taiwan itself, but this will obviously be, you know, ringing bells for Malaysia and the Philippines and Japan and Indonesia and India as well, going, look, the US is back. We are foreign policy focused. You know, we are here and we care about East Asia, which has been something that, you know, the Obama administration talked about a lot. And we've seen so many administrations talk about building an Indo-Pacific strategy, but nothing has been as concrete as I think anyone would have liked to see. So by doing this, I think it does signal to the world that the US is you know, much more interested again in East Asia. And yes, I'm also a little bit cynical that, you know, the midterms are coming up, and this is a fantastic wedge issue, and this will be something that, you know, will be quite popular with the US, being, you know, Democrat or Republican. I think people like to think they want to be tough on China. So the timing seems about right, and Pelosi seems like probably the person to send. I don't think Kamala Harris has the foreign policy chops yet, and I think Biden would be too big an escalation. So I think Pelosi's that Goldilocks in the middle to send on this one.
Oh, I wanted to follow up on this in a couple of regards. So the first issue is to why. So if Pelosi was going to go in April, why the freak out now? I think there's a couple answers for that. Number one, in April, it seems like that the Chinese did kind of privately signal, right? They're like, hey, this probably wouldn't be great to the United States side. But then it got canceled because of the COVID thing. So, all right, you know, no harm, no foul. Several things have happened since April that I think make the Chinese heighten this sort of political sense of danger or the crossing of Chinese red lines. The first is Biden's statement, right, about the U.S. coming to Taiwan's defense back in, I believe, May. So that happens, and there's, I think the Chinese there wasn't as much of a freak out because on the Chinese side, I think that was mostly us freaking out about what he said. I think the Chinese kind of assumed that, like, yeah, we can't take U.S. intervention off the table entirely. But it is this sort of marker of like, okay, right? Biden said that. It created this buzz in the United States. You have Mark Esper, former Secretary of Defense under Trump, goes to Taiwan and in July and says that in a meeting with Tsai Ing-wen that the United States should reconsider its one China policy. And yes, Esper is not a current official, but he was the last SecDef under Trump. I guess technically not. This was some kind of guy at the very last minutes there. But Esper, a Secretary of Defense for the Trump administration, saying something like that. Pompeo has said similar things on earlier trips to Taiwan, and then you have the party Congress getting closer. So I think you have these confluence of other things meeting together here. As far as what Mike said to sending Kamala Harris or Biden, yeah, that would be bad. It depends on where you sit, right? Like if you don't want there to be another crisis in the Taiwan Strait, that would be a bad idea. If you want to signal that the U.S. is fully behind Taiwan, it could be a good idea. But the Speaker of the House is still a big deal, right? Like it's the highest ranking official since Newt in '97, and the '97 visit came on the heels of the last Taiwan Strait crisis. So I think that there was the fight was kind of out of China at that point, but the U.S. also, I think, agreed to have some kind of circuitous travel schedule for Newt. So, yeah.
Can I just ask you, Eric? Biden and Xi spoke last weekend, and obviously a high-level meeting like that is in some sense highly ritualized, and they know, in a sense, very carefully what they want to say and how they want to say it. So from that conversation, however tense and fraught that it was, would both of them have a real sense of just how far each of them were prepared to push up to the line in reaction to Pelosi's visit? So are they more comfortable with it now, having spoken to one another, than they would have been before?
I don't know. That's very hard to know without knowing precisely what they said. I mean, we have the readouts, and the readouts are pretty good. It seems like Xi Jinping and reiterated, like, yeah, we take this seriously. Biden reiterated that U.S. policy is unchanged, which is the same thing he did after the whole, we will defend Taiwan thing. The State Department released, I think it was the State Department, released statements afterwards being like, this does not mean that U.S., one China policy is adjusted. So I don't know if that makes them more comfortable in it. I mean, I think that what was interesting is that yesterday, the Biden admin, through I can't remember who, but someone from the Biden admin, some spokesman was saying like, oh yeah, like we had no problem with this Pelosi visit. Like it was gonna be, yeah, no, we want her to go. And that's kind of like a bald-faced lie. Because there was a lot of hand-wringing before that phone call with Xi about this, and the admin kind of saying like, oh, the military doesn't think that was a weird one. Like the military doesn't think this would be a good idea, so you shouldn't do it. Which just made Congress mad because co-equal branch of government, and who is the president / who is Xi Jinping to be dictating the travel schedule of the Speaker of the House, which fair enough, right? But again, this is why I get frustrated when things become all about resolve. Again, it's just very hard, even if people want to find ways to kind of adjust and back down, they can't because it's been made about resolve.
And I want to ask a question to both Eric and Michael on this and get their perspective on it, because it'll be fascinating to see what their answer is. China is going to respond in some way or fashion when she lands in Taipei because of the issue you just mentioned, Eric. They are not going to be seen to do nothing about it. So, Eric, first to you and then to you, Michael. What is a proportionate response And on what timeline should we expect a response from China to express how they feel about Pelosi being in Taipei?
Well, they might not do a proportionate response. But I mean, I think we're already seeing some of the response. It's trade punishment on Taiwan itself. It's inching, it's putting ships and aircraft closer to the median line in the strait. Exercises are probably going to be a thing. I think I imagine some were already scheduled because it's, I think, a generally peak time for PLA training cycle right now. But I think we're going to see more exercises. I think the big question is, the intensity and over the what time period, because it's entirely possible that China does not have to respond right away. They could do some sort of early measures, and then they could wait, right? They could wait for the Party Congress. I've been wondering to myself, like, does Xi Jinping kind of use this going into the Party Congress, probably in November, to say, and these are the reasons why we need to adopt a tougher line on Taiwan, and they go ahead with some kind of more aggressive policy change after the Party Congress. So this moment of sort of political sensitivity, you get through it, and then that clears the way for an even tougher response. I mean, I think the big question is, like, what can they do? What can the Chinese do that signals seriousness and reinforces the red line in their mind, that doesn't also cause an escalation they wish to avoid? And that's a delicate balancing act. And of course, in a crisis, one of the reasons why a crisis is a crisis is it's hard to predict what will happen. Yeah. But I think at the bare minimum, you'll see military exercises, maybe not like in the strait itself, but sort of like to the areas north and south of it. And then also an expansion of the sort of trade punishment that we're already seeing.
Michael, do you see it the same way?
That's my guess for near term. Long term, a bit more murky.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think Eric's pretty much hit it on the head. I think if they're really bold, we might see maybe some overflights getting further into Taiwanese airspace, although they have been ducking in and out of Taiwanese airspace all morning. We may see Chinese exercises that will either go past Okinawa or Guam, but again, it'll just be freedom of navigation stuff. We may see an expansion of some of the bases towards in the Spratlys and the Tuna Basin. That again, these would be big escalations if China really wants to make a meal out of this, but going into the Party Congress. Otherwise, DDoS attacks, they'll ramp up some propaganda. We'll probably see the Mandarin-speaking Telegram channels or equivalents very, very busy over the next couple of days. But yeah, it's very hard to predict how much China will want to respond to this, whether they want to have it as a sort of the story of the week, and in a week's time we'll go back to thinking about something else, or whether they want to keep this drum effectively banging along so we can go into the Party Congress in November with it hanging, being the main point of focus for Xi. And who right now is, he's having some economic problems, particularly with the agricultural banks in the south. We're seeing the Chinese economy is still having to deal with COVID, and there are COVID lockdowns, so this might be a good political thing for him to attach himself to, rather than talking about economy, jobs, and growth in China, which is usually the sort of the talking points that Xi would love. So it is really difficult to see. But yeah, I think Eric's pretty much hit the nail on the head. But the longer term we look at this, the more difficult it's going to be to predict.
Eric, can we zoom out a bit and just have a look at the wider picture? And when it comes to this part of the world, and we've seen China increasingly assert itself in the South China Sea with its string of pearl archipelago of artificial islands, and with claims to territorial waters, which are seen as international waters. And we've had those freedom of navigation voyages, and the Australian Navy has had numerous encounters with the Chinese Navy, as have other navies, in relation to being shattered or challenged in international waters. Is this likely to be? Is this gathering its own momentum in a way that it's now impossible to stop? And this particular event with Pelosi's visit into Taiwan is another change of gear on that, and is heating up the rhetoric and once again making the Chinese feel that they need to continue to assert themselves in the same way. And in a sense, what you talked about, resolve being what it is, that they can't be seen to de-escalate anyway in order to save face. So are we likely to see more of that sort of activity in the South China Sea, and once again causing those sorts of problems for all the neighbouring countries that rely on that waterway as the major route for international trade?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that even if this didn't happen, the glide path of U.S.-China relations was heading for increased tension, right? I don't know now the scale and the speed at which that increase occurred. I think is more variable than we give it credit for, but there is this sort of inescapability, right? So I don't know. I might get in trouble for this. I identify myself as a realist, right, from the realism school of international politics. And when you have a rising great power in a major region like Asia, I think that the tendency for, at the bare minimum, tension or contentious relationships between the U.S. and China was somewhat bound to happen, as two large powers with competing interests bump up against one another. I think we could, in which case, I think then it is on the United States to figure out, okay, how do you set yourself up for that, and how do you handle it? I worry that with the way things are going on Taiwan, especially, and the way that so much of this is going to become about resolve and credibility, I worry that it hits the gas on a development that could have happened slower, that could have happened in a more sort of planned out strategic way on America's side, but also on China's side. And that, I worry about like the short-term risk of some kind of conflict or serious thing because of it. But I do think that there was this kind of, aspect of some inevitability to just a greater chance for a conflict because of, a rising power, a relative declining challenger, and interests that diverge. And a way out of this, right? There, the ways out of this that some folks have talked about, right? Things like spheres of influence, right? Things like some kind of modus vivendi or a grand bargain. You could use those, right? You could use those to kind of create certain rules and make this chance of a direct confrontation somewhat less likely. But number one, a lot of minor powers find themselves in a bad place if in situations like that, so they don't want it for good reason, I think. And I think it also requires a level of compromise on the part of U.S. and Chinese interests that neither side is willing to make right now.
Michael, can I ask you, for the near neighbours in the region, this is a very anxious time, and people who live in those countries have to try to come to terms with the idea that within our region there are these two global powers butting up against one another, and our governments are having to navigate both the trading relationship with China and a strategic relationship with the United States at various and different degrees. So how difficult it is for those regional governments to look at what's going on and seeing Nancy Pelosi arriving in Taipei and not wanting to be chewing their fingernails down to the quick.
I mean, look at both your accent and my accent. We're both sitting in Australia at the moment, and we are a classic example of this problem that, if war was to break out between the United States and China, we are stuck in the middle, where if we were to side with the United States, our cultural partner, our defense partner, our first people we have treaties with, then that's our biggest export and a huge part of our economy just disappearing overnight. And if we were to side with China, then we are going against a nation with the world's largest navy who could effectively, if they wanted to, blockade us. It leaves us in an absolute no-win position. And this is not a unique position to take just for Australia. This is the same one that Indonesia, that Thailand, that Bangladesh, that the Philippines, all of these countries are in, where China is a huge part of their economy. But even if they wanted to, either stay out of it or side with the US on a soft side, this conflict will make them have to pick one side or the other. And right now, that's very difficult to do. If you look at particularly the economies of Indonesia and the Philippines, China is such a large part of that economy that it really does make it difficult for them to ever, just rip that out overnight. So it's a tough call to make, that you're either stuck with, trying to, side with your defense partner or side with your trade partner. And if war was to break out, let's say between the United States and China, the first aspects of that would likely be, fighting within the South China Sea, which again, if you are looking at basic economics, most people have part of their supply chain in China. So even if, let's say, you can build this, this tractor, it's the microchips or it's the little components inside the tractor that will come from China, which effectively kills the capacity to build it anyway. So China is so tied into everyone at the moment that, a war between Washington and Beijing would effectively make everyone in the region a loser. So I think every side here is hoping that, neither side goes to war. In the same way that, people living in Berlin really didn't, were watching, Moscow and Washington very, very closely, as they would be at the epicenter of this. And East Asia is effectively the, almost the Berlin of the 21st century, in my opinion.
So, Eric, I mean, that economic interdependency was supposed to, over generations, the institutional interdependency was supposed to make war unattractive or conflict economically not viable. It wasn't worth your while because, you, as Michael just pointed out, your economic self-interest was invested in good relations with your neighbours. Is that particular dynamic slowly slipping away at the start of the 21st century?
I mean, I think the extent to which that was actually true was always somewhat, I think, less clear than I think popular understanding is, right? The fun counterpoint to that is Germany was, before World War I, Germany was like the UK's largest trading partner or France's largest trading partner, something like that. So I think that there is something to the argument that, yes, interconnected economies stand to suffer more from conflict. But I think that it's a question of, what interests are salient and why and when. If something is really, if nationalism is on the upswing, for example, then maybe the calculus changes, and maybe you're willing to suffer that economic pain in order to achieve territorial ambitions or other political ambitions that are more important at the moment. When it comes to China too, the idea of helping it develop in the hopes that it also becomes a more liberalized place was U.S. policy for a long time. And there's definitely a perception in Washington right now that was a big mistake. I'm not going to comment on what I thought, but I think, that's the perception. And there's also this effort on the part of the United States to reduce supply chains in China and to try and see about decoupling on purpose, in part for economic security reasons. In which case, I think some of this interconnectedness that you guys mentioned, it might just be getting rolled back for a mix of sort of the rise of nationalist politics, both in the United States, but also around the world, and also the COVID-19 pandemic and, the lessons that taught in terms of the supply of things like PPE, right? So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if trade is gonna bail us out of this one. But it does raise that interesting question about the value of interconnectedness and what it can and can't do for you at a moment where I think there's a lot of skepticism about that value.
Michael, just a couple of questions before we wind up tonight's Twitter Space conversation about Pelosi in Taipei. She must be fastening her tray table and her seatbelt as we speak.
No, apparently she has landed.
Wheels down.
She is wheels down and in Taipei as we speak.
Okay, so she's there and picking up the duty free as she goes through the customs hall. Just to finish on a note of optimism, what's the way forward here that everyone can be a winner? Is there such a thing, or is that just ridiculous on my part?
I think the way forward would to effectively, it sounds weird, but sort of a Marshall Plan 2.0 and help and really, go forward with this East Asian partnerships and effectively make the US a large part of the economy or a large trade partner, of particularly your Indonesias, your Thailands, your Philippines, and those guys, and show the world that, that China isn't the only option on the table. Because a lot of these countries, maybe if they don't want to deal with China or they don't like how integrated China is into their economy, quite often don't have many other economic options. Frankly, if you need, microchips built, you need this built, you need manufacturing, you need, even India, who has a large, labor pool to buy stuff from, still doesn't have the internal business dynamics that make it easy to do business inside India like it is in China. If the US can help build up these, particularly Indonesia, as an option, as a sort of option for business that, yes, they might have to pay 10% more, but that would be worth it to go to Indonesia versus China. I think this is a moment where the community might be able to get behind him. And if Biden can pull this off, he might actually be able to get some good support behind him and effectively form, a much more integrated ASEAN, a much more integrated Asia that trades with each other and trades with the West, rather than just with China. Effectively provides that counterbalance that, frankly, the US hasn't taken East Asia as seriously as it probably should have. And a lot of countries gone, well, we don't like China, we don't like China's policies, but rhetoric doesn't build highways, so we're going to go with the guy who's offering to pay for the highway. And I think this is a good opportunity that if the rhetoric does ratchet up and China does enter the psyche of the average American voter, that foreign policy may actually be a primary issue in an election, which quite often it's not. And I think if it is a primary issue, then we might actually have the domestic support for the US to take East Asia much more seriously and build a much more integrated East Asian region.
Just to finish, Eric, is that already started, the focus on East Asia? We saw Kamala Harris, the Vice President, addressing some of the Pacific Island nations in the last week or so, admitting that the US had taken its eyes off the ball in that region after there's been a very concerted Chinese foreign policy attempt to garner influence in the Pacific. Has the mood changed, and will it be sustained?
I hope so. Right. I agree pretty much with everything Mike said. I think the U.S. needs to have a better vision for what it wants to do in Asia beyond being reactive to Chinese policies, and especially on trade and political issues just beyond security. Right. I think that's important. And I would hope that would happen. You talked about, like, is there a situation where everyone wins here? I don't know. I don't think there is. But I think on the U.S. side, I just would like to see us be a bit more purposeful about how we do things, because it seems like with the Pelosi trip, and several other analysts have raised this, so this isn't a unique point to me, but there's a lot of performative stuff in the United States right now. There's a lot of sort of performative toughness on China, in terms of rhetoric, in terms of saying like what the U.S. ought to do, and it's not really being supported much by actual policy. And I think that what worries me about this approach is that it sets you up for those, can't escape situations. It sets you up for these things where you take a sort of high profile statement or a visit, and it becomes this bigger thing sort of out of your control, with real strategic consequences. And the U.S. strategy is not prepared, I don't think, for those consequences. So if it were up to me, I'd invert that, right? And I'd rather see a coherent vision for U.S. strategy in Asia that is properly resourced. And I'm a hippy dippy restrainer. I know that all of my stuff isn't going to become reality, but I would hope that at the bare minimum, some more policy purposefulness to what the U.S. is doing. So that way, if you do wind yourself up in a situation like we're in right now with Pelosi's visit, it doesn't feel so. It feels like we're sleepwalking into a crisis, and I don't like that.
No, none of us do. Look,
Yeah.
I just want to say thank you so much, Eric Gomez. You might be a hippy-dippy restrainer, but you're our favourite hippy-dippy restrainer. So thank you for being with us.
I'll take it.
In our Twitter space tonight for this conversation. Michael Hilliard, thank you as well for your expertise. I really appreciate it. And people can find the Redline podcast on all their favourite platforms. And just before I let you go, what have you got planned for the next one, Michael?
We're doing a piece on the geopolitics of human trafficking, which is, again, just a whole bunch of nightmare fuel, but an incredibly interesting issue and one that we've been working on for quite a while now. So very excited to get that one out.
And when's that one due to drop?
That'll be on Sunday.
Okay, there we go. All right, so there, hot off the presses. Well, my name's Francis Leach. It's been great. This has been my first go round with the Redline podcast, and I've really enjoyed the conversations with Eric and Michael, and we'll do it again soon. And we thank you for being with us tonight or this morning, wherever you are, and stay safe, everybody. Bye-bye.